thinking that the last time many of the commemorations, when you were in this room, was 2 months ago, March the 8th, when we were celebrating the launch of the great book by Christina O'Connor and Eddie Cantwell on Waterford Women of the Revolution. So it was a nice follow-on talk, so thanks very much for that. Okay, so our last talk this morning, delighted to welcome Kieran Allen. So Kieran is an Associate Professor at the School of Sociology in UCD. He's the author of several books, including The Celtic Tiger, The Myth of Social Partnership, The Politics of James Connolly, and 1916, Ireland's Revolutionary Tradition. And the title of Kieran's talk this morning is Fighting for Their Rights, Waterford Agriculture Workers and the Irish Revolution.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a great privilege to listen to people like Emmett and Pat, who give tremendous detail on what happened in Waterford's lesser-known Civil War. And I just want to say that, like Terry here, I won't be dealing specifically with the agrarian conflict in Waterford, because I can't really add anything to the detail that's been stated. But what I'm going to try to do is put it in a slightly more general context and hopefully make some connections for today. Where are we going here? Okay, so let's start off with today. Right. I mean, you think about Irish history, you think, you read about the period before 1916, and there's apparently a play in the Abbey by Synge about the playboy, the Western World, and there are riots. And you say, my God, what's all that about? And then you look at this picture here, and you think, well, what has there recently been such an outrage over any piece of art as probably this one here? And the question is, why is there so much passion expended on what is, after all, quite a well-composed picture? And I think it has to do with the fact that it challenges a certain romantic nationalist view of Irish history. In other words, that any of the social problems we ever faced in Ireland were to do with the British. And therefore, to find somebody else replacing the bailiffs, the British bailiffs, with Irish Gardaí, well, that's kind of a bit upsetting. And what it does is it kind of challenges a certain view that's very deep in Ireland, that left-wing ideas are foreign and they're Bolshevik and they come from these exotic places, and they aren't really anything to do with what happened in Ireland. Now, when you listen to the talks about what happened in Waterford, I mean, obviously that is completely dispelled. So what I want to do really is to examine how the events in Waterford took place in the context of the Irish Revolution. Now, when I was growing up, we never used the term Irish Revolution. It was called the War of Independence. And then there was a big battle between De Valera and Michael Collins, and that was the kind of story. It's only in recent years we start talking about a revolution. There was actually a revolution in this country, and just to indicate why, I mean, that's really on the last 10, 15 years that the term has come into popular usage. If you look at, some of you may remember Brian Farrell, who was a professor of politics in my university, UCD, and went on to chair, I forget the name of the program in RTE, but his basic idea was, there was no revolution here. What are you talking about? This was just simply a continuation of the British parliamentary constitutional tradition that went a little bit astray for a few years, but eventually we got back on track, and we had essentially a struggle against the British Empire led by essentially people who held British liberal conservative views. And similarly, Tom Garvin, he writes his book on 1922, and again he makes the argument, it's just a period, this period, 1920, 1923 maybe, it got a bit out of hand, but order was eventually restored with the formation of the Free State. And we've seen Pat has illustrated some precise means what this meant, order being restored. But the idea was, to quote Tom Garvey, he said, the Hobbesian sense of the necessity of imposing a political order. Hobbes being the sort of political theorist who believed you had to have a strong state to bring about a bit of order in society. Now, I want to argue that actually what happened in Ireland was a revolution. And the term revolution is kind of thrown around more loosely now. Let's just look a little bit more precisely at what it means. And I've just put down here 4 characteristics of what I think happens during a revolution. I want to add one more that's relevant to this discussion in the end. So the first feature of revolution is the elite, usually a small number of people. Let's keep it out of controversy. Let's talk about the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the aristocrats, they lose the support of the middle strata in society, and before you know it, all hell has broken loose. So in any stable society, a small political elite must keep a hold in terms of domination of ideas of the middle strata in society. In a revolution, that gets broken down. Secondly, the mass of people in a revolutionary situation don't just be concerned about their gardens, watching the television, but suddenly decide we're going to play a role in shaping our society. That's what happens in revolutions. And that leads to a very heightened degree of political awareness, political consciousness, people discussing all sorts of events happening in the world. And the last point I want to make here, or second last point rather, is revolutions don't start out with people wanting a brilliant, utopian, perfect world. They actually start out with very small things, like we want more land, we want bread, we want peace, we want 38 shillings a week. This is often why people enter into a process that radicalizes, and eventually you get to a revolutionary point of view. Now, the one thing I haven't mentioned here, but I should mention relevant, is every revolution has a counter-revolution. There's always a reaction against this sort of thing happening in society. Think of Sudan at the moment, for example. People may not be aware that in 4 years ago, in 2018, there was a revolution in Sudan. All this process happened. People got involved. Resistance committees are set up. The dictator is sent out. And then what we're seeing now is a conflict between 2 generals of a counter-revolution that put down the people who were trying to revolt. Now, not quite happened in Ireland, but let's come to the role of the counter-revolution in Ireland as well. So, when we talk about revolutions, therefore, they have different forms and different shapes. So if you think about the Russian Revolution, it starts out with women in February looking for bread and peace. It escalates. There's the formation of Soviets, a term we'll come to in a minute, which means that people form alternative forms of government to run their town, distribute food, make sure the basic necessities of life are met. There's an insurrection in October 2017. Before that, I should say, there was an attempt at counter-revolution, which was defeated, Kornilov coup, and eventually the Bolsheviks seized power. Now look at the Irish Revolution, and the process is almost in reverse. You start off with an attempted insurrection in 1916, which, by the way, was not simply a blood sacrifice. It was a serious attempt to take power by Pearse, Connolly, and so on. The insurrection fails. There's then a major election in 1918, where Sinn Féin destroys the Irish Parliamentary Party. There's then a period of armed struggle, and as I'll try to show in a minute, there is, in the end, a counter-revolution. And in many ways, understanding what happens in Waterford, it's important to understand that background. So let's look at 4 fronts of what I would consider the Irish Revolution and try to indicate what that means. The first is there is an extraordinary level of mass resistance. There is an attempt at what we call a dual power, of setting up alternative structures to the existing state. There is the involvement, this is really the point I want to make, there is an intermeshing of national aspirations and class and social aspirations, one of the issues that are often ignored in the writing of Irish history. And that in particular affects the issue of the land, and in particular landless labourers. Okay, let's look at the question of the armed struggle. People often debate, is the IRA the new IRA versus the old IRA? And I'm not going to get into that debate, except to say this. Just think of the scale of the old IRA. We're talking about, estimates vary, we're talking about 100,000 people join an illegal armed group called the IRA. Now, of that, because there's less people don't have guns, it's estimated about 15,000 people are bearing arms with this. So this is a huge mass movement. And the aim of that movement was to, first of all, isolate the RIC and to create what was called in Vietnam liberated zones. Zones of the country where the British state had no hold, no grip on power. And that could only happen not just through the armed struggle, but through the involvement of lots and lots and lots of people in a boycott campaign. And if you look at the scale of the boycott, you're talking about every time an RUC officer arrived to Mass, to a shop, people walked out. They were literally ostracised. If you look here at this, the Westmeath Council, right? The Westmeath Council, this is the elected representative of Westmeath. Look at what they do in 1919. They congratulate the RIC members who resigned from the force. They agreed to pay the IRA unit, the local IRA unit that's involved in an armed conflict with them, and the board of directors of the local hospital refused to treat RIC men. So this is how, essentially, the forces of law and order of the British state are pushed out of control of Ireland. Secondly, a revolution involves a form of dual power. Most revolutions involve forms of dual power. Whether it's in Russia, it's the attempt to create Soviets, workers' councils in Moscow, Petersburg, all over the place, that effectively are dictating what happens in their cities. Now, in Ireland, you have a different type of dual power, and the most successful dual power was the formation of republican courts. So the population decide, we're no longer interested in accepting justice from the British, we're setting up our own republican courts, and we're going to call the judge the Brehon, which is the Irish word for judge historically. Now, what's interesting about this, I often get into scandalous arguments over this. People elected the Brehon. They voted for the judge. Now, if you said today, we'll have a vote on who the local judge will be, you'd be thrown out the window. I mean, this is just not on. But I'm sorry, people did elect the judges in the Republican courts. They tended to elect clergymen, this is true. They tended to elect more respectable, good talkers and all that sort of thing. But they did elect the people. And over a period, the Republican courts replace the British dominated institutions, so that the Irish Times says the Sinn Féin tribunals are jostling British law into oblivion as fast as cars jostle pedestrians off the road. So they were really very successful. Less successful was the attempt to use a boycott by local authorities, local councils, to turn their back on the British state and to raise rates and to use that to fund the IRA. That was far less successful for all sorts of reasons. Nevertheless, there was an attempt to form dual power. Okay, one of the ways that people think of revolutions is that they categorise it. Ireland is a national revolution. Russia was a communist revolution. But when masses of people begin to change their own lives, people don't think in terms of categories like that. It's not as rigid as that. And therefore you find, this is the issue that's really come into the fore in recent years, is the involvement of Labour in the wider national revolution. So it starts with the fight against conscription, which is a very key moment, because the British try to, as they're beginning to, the war is coming to an end, they begin to they attempt to bring up final reserves of manpower, but that's defeated by huge strikes, also, by the way, supported by the Catholic bishops at the time. And that's the first, really, involvement of Labour in the national question. But then you begin to look at the other events that occur. Take, for example, this one, the Limerick Soviet. Now, think about it for a minute. Limerick Soviet. I mean, Soviet's not a word commonly used in Ireland, was not at the time. There was no internet. The number of people reading, foreign newspapers about events in Moscow must be tiny. But nevertheless, in May of 1919, there is a huge, May of 1918, there's a huge demonstration in Limerick in support of the Soviet regime in Russia. Fact. And therefore, the year afterwards, when there's an uprising in the town about the British Army insisting on permits, it's called the Limerick Soviet. Okay? Now, it's not quite as the same as the Russian one, but the name is significant. But let's look at this slightly lesser known strike in March 1920. This begins over the fact that the government wants to remove regulations on the price of bacon, right? And what happens is you get a strike where workers, often in memory of the Irish famine, decide we're not going to let bacon be exported from Ireland, we're against the speculation in meat, and here's a statement from the ITUC, the equivalent of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions: we do not recognise the right of the owners of bacon factories to withhold their premises and machinery from use at their discretion against the common interest. These material structures have been built and adapted by workers for a social purpose, i.e. to provide bacon for the people. If those who hold these things in trust fail to fulfil their trust, the people must relieve them of their trust. Now, that's a rather radical statement, but you can see it as part of a national revolution. So, is this a nationalist demand, or is it a social demand? And what you get is an intermixing of the two at the time. And, I mean, Emmett particularly has been a pioneer in really bringing out the level of radicalism that existed in Ireland at the time. I'm just stuck for time here, but you can read some of these quotations yourself, which indicates the people of Ireland. I mean, we have this image of Ireland as a conservative country, only now beginning to change. It's just not true. Ireland was always there was always great upsurges of radicalism in this country, and if you read through the detail of what happened in the 18 local general strikes, you get the impression. But the one I want, this is where the context of Waterford is important. You see, in this national revolt, in most national liberation movements, the question of land and who owns land always comes up. It's very rare you can have a fight, of Algerian fight against the French Empire or whatever, and people say, oh, we're not going to touch the question of the land. The question of the land always comes up in every national liberation movement. And in Ireland, it comes up, I'm not going to go into it here, but in a massive campaign of cattle drives, burning of the big houses, attempts, if you like, to take over the farm. But for our purposes here, or the purpose in terms of this particular seminar, the role of the agricultural labourers are important. Now, have a look at this. This is an agricultural labourers' strike in the nearby county of Carlow. And I think Emmett made the point, these weren't strikes like happened in more recent times. This is the strike of agricultural labourers in Carlow. The Red commandants have perfected their plan of campaign and the rank and file are ready. This has to be no mere stay-out holiday strike. The time is past when battles are won by men on holiday. The experience of last year's land strike has proved that if the proletariat of the land are to win against organised farmers, victory only comes through organised aggression. We talked about incendiarism before. Not organised passivity. Terrorism, note the word, terrorism is the most potent of labour's weapons, and while every other weaponry in our army must be used, it is on red terror that our greatest reliance must be placed. This is not some radical left-wing newspaper. This is the official newspaper of the trade union movement, the watchword of labour, at the time. So what we're finding here is a very different image of what happens in Ireland in the so-called War of Independence. And it's in that context you've got to view the farm workers' strike in Waterford. This is part of a general movement, both of people trying to seize land from the big estates, but also landless labourers, which has been more than adequately covered by Pat and Emmett. So the point I want to make really here is that when we think of this period, it's important not to engage in a type of mechanical thinking that says there was a revolution, but it was just a nationalist revolution. It was just really about getting rid of the British. And the issue was only the Irish were all lined up against the British. It's not as simple as that, because when you actually look at it, there is a fusion. So when people say, I want freedom, what do you mean you want freedom? You want freedom for the British Empire, yeah? But you presumably you want a freedom from poverty, or you want freedom to have land, and so on. So all of these ideas come meshing in together in this great period of upheaval. Okay, now let's look at the downside. That's, if you like, the up. Now let's look at what happened on the down. And how did the British respond to this? And they responded, as we know, through the recruitment of the Black and Tans, through moving quickly to the partition of Ireland, through the essentially collaboration with the UVF, and to, British strategy is always not very crude, to outreaching to a certain section of the Republican movement. In fact, they decided from very early on they should open a back channel and begin talking to a section of the Republican movement. Okay, therefore, the question is, how did the Republican movement respond to this, if you like, fusion of social and national demands? And in particular, how do they respond to the question of the land agitation? And the answer is, of the 100,000 people who are members of the IRA, different responses. I mean, we heard the example in Waterford of where an IRA unit essentially is opening up fire on Free State soldiers who are involved in supporting the farmers' protest. In general, however, let's take the Minister for Agriculture, Art O'Connor. He says that the land seizures were a grave menace to the Republic, to the fight of the Republicans. He says the mind of the people are being diverted from the struggle for freedom by the class war. So for the Republican leadership, this is a diversion. It's a problem. If you look, for example, at Sean Moylan in Mayo, he talks about how the IRA becomes the main agent in suppressing the land agitation, in stopping it and so on. And this, in many ways, the failure to see the land struggle, the social struggle as a positive element in mobilising people to bring about an end to empire, in many ways what that means is the War of Independence becomes a purely military conflict, and as probably a very talented military leader, Michael Collins, puts it, he says we're down to our last round of ammunition, we're not going to defeat the British militarily, and hence the need for a treaty. Okay, let me just move on then. And that then really brings me to the last point I want to make. One of the new stories being told in Ireland is that the Irish state, as we know it today, is a direct descendant of the people of 1916. I'm old enough to remember when commemorations for 1916 were banned, but we've now done a turn and we're now said, well, actually, we are the proud inheritors of 1916 and the present state is the proud inheritors of 1916. I just want to put a question mark on that, right? And just going to finish on the concept of a counter-revolution. So let's look at it very simply. The treaty is signed in December 1921, and as we know, there's then a debate about whether the treaty is accepted or not. The Catholic Church intervenes quite clearly and says, and I quote from this encyclical, the men who made the treaty would be immortal. The Catholic Church came out clearly in support of the treaty, as did most of the more respectable elements in Irish society, but people like Larkin were very much opposed to it. The Civil War commences. It commences, now I don't want to open old wounds and start a long discussion about Civil War, but just factually, right? The Civil War commences when there is, number one, a huge level of support that's supplied by the former enemy Britain to the Free State government in terms of mortar, weaponry, and so on. At the end, for example, after the bombing of the Four Courts, Churchill writes to Collins and he says, if I refrain from bombing the Four Courts to remove the Republicans who'd occupied it, he says, if I refrain from congratulation, it is only because I do not want to embarrass you. The archives of the Four Courts may be scattered, but the title deeds of Ireland are safe. In other words, you've done the job in destroying the Republicans who've occupied the Four Courts. Now, this is the point I want to get to. Okay, so there is a civil war, the irregulars, the Republicans defeat, and so on. But what's interesting, and I think Pat's talk brings this out very well, is this means the people who come to run this state have certain ideologies, certain attitudes that are not simply defined by the proclamation of 1916. So if we look at what the Sinn Féin writer P.S. O'Hegarty says, he says, what you get really in this period, 1922-23, is the rise of the Clongowes Woods boys. Now, for those of you from Dublin, not from Dublin, Clongowes Woods is still one of the best known private schools in the land, and it still was in those days one of the best known private schools in the land. And essentially, you find people like Kevin O'Higgins, who says, I mean, this really sums up the attitude of Kevin O'Higgins, and he becomes really the key figure in the Irish state at this particular point in time. He said the attitude of protest, the attitude of negation, the attitude sometimes of sheer wantonness and waywardness and destructiveness, which has been to a large extent the traditional attitude on behalf of the Irish people. We have to stop this. We have to wipe out this attitude of negativity and destructiveness and all the quotes you've seen from Pat. And this really is the basis for the formation of the Special Infantry Corps. Now, really, I only came across the idea of the existence of a Special Infantry Corps about 2 or 3 years ago. I think most people never heard there was a Special Infantry Corps set up in Ireland of 5,000 soldiers to break social agitation. I mean, that's an extraordinary fact that most people do not know of, and it pertains not just to Waterford, but as we know, for example, they played the role in the defeat of the Waterford, but it was involved in all sorts of suppression of the agrarian outrages across the country. So, for example, the Special Infantry Corps seizes land from hill farmers in Cork, and even one of the pro-treaty TDs says, these people, the hill farmers, gave us assistance when we were out in the hills fighting against an alien government. I think it's a very bad action for the government to seize the cattle on these farms for arrears of rent due to England. So I would argue that you have a revolution, but you also have a counter-revolution, a suppression of the social aspirations that emerged at this particular point in time. And in the end, this is my controversial bit, sorry, but it is the state we have today was shaped by that counter-revolution. And you can see that in a whole number of ways. It was shaped by the fact that the Republican courts were disbanded immediately after the Civil War. We took on the British court model. The judges put on the wigs, they put on the gowns, they did exactly what the British court model was. One of the interesting things about Ireland is the lack of local government structures. I mean, you can elect. I mean, we will have council elections. I urge you all to vote in next year. But I'm telling you, you can elect councillors, but in the end, it'll be the chief executive officer that will make most decisions on the council. We have a very limited level of local democracy in Ireland compared to other countries, and one of the reasons for that is that the new government, worried about the implications of local governments taking on a position that they had in the Irish Revolution, changed that. And lastly, we had the ideology of the balanced budget. In other words, that, my God, we cannot be spending on anything that would put the state in debt, and that includes particularly public services to do with disability, with health, education, and so on. And that tradition, okay, came in afterwards in terms of the ideology of neoliberalism, but it's been there really from the start. And, okay, the last point to make is, so why then did Ireland become the most Catholic country in the world? And one answer is, what did you get from the revolution? You didn't get more land, you didn't get probably better services, but you got a Catholic country. And Catholicism, therefore, in some ways, this is not to disparage it, it functioned as a kind of spiritual antidepressant. In other words, that we didn't do this, we didn't do that, but at least we got our religion. And we pushed our religion, we developed our religion, and so on. That seems to me to be one of the elements of the story that brings it up to this day. Okay, thank you very much.